The pounding on the door rattled the thin wood. He stood behind it, hand pressed against the frame, staring at the lock as if it could solve the problem by itself. "I said go," he called, voice low and flat, almost bored, but the hammering didn't stop. She leaned into it, shoulders shaking with cold and something heavier, something raw in her chest. "I will die if I go," she said, the words tearing out of her, ragged and urgent. "That ain't my fault," he said, the door trembling from another hit. Silence stretched a beat too long, then the sound of her sobs filled it, smaller now, ragged breaths mixing with the wind. He exhaled, almost without noticing, and pulled the bolt. The door creaked open a crack. She froze mid-step, eyes wide and hollow, hands clutching a coat that smelled faintly of smoke and dust. "Stop talking," he said. She obeyed, her chest rising and falling, and the wind carried the echo of her fear inside. He looked at her hands, trembling over the fabric, and at her face, gaunt and pale. Hunger had hollowed her out, but there was more. He could feel it pressing against the air, a weight he hadn't wanted to notice. "Food," she said quietly, almost ashamed. "Just food. I'm not asking for shelter. Please." He squinted. Her words were small, too small to carry the demand of them. His eyes caught the bulge under her coat, subtle but unmistakable. He reached instinctively. "Wait," he whispered. "What are you hiding?" Her eyes darted, and then something shifted inside her coat, a faint rustle, a small, desperate sound that made his chest seize. He stepped back, opening the door wider. She tilted her head, as if reading his hesitation. She began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Not yet." His hand hovered over the fabric again. She shivered violently, and he realized the shiver wasn't just from the wind. She was trembling from fear, from exhaustion, from whatever secret she carried pressed against her chest. He reached in slowly, carefully, like a man handling something alive and fragile for the first time. The sound answered him, a small, weak noise, not quite crying, not yet, but breathing. He froze, chest tight. The woman's knees buckled, and she sank to the wooden porch without warning. Reflex took over. He caught her under the arms, holding her upright, and the faint sound persisted, quivering inside the coat. His fingers brushed the bundle, hesitating over what he could not yet name. Bread was in his other hand, crusty, warm from the oven he barely tended. He handed it over, slow, deliberate. She accepted it, eyes locked on him, and whispered nothing. The wind stilled. The silence stretched. Only the rustle under the coat answered. "What are you hiding?" he repeated, quieter now, almost afraid of the sound of the words. She pressed closer to him, shaking, and the faint life beneath the coat stirred again. The porch, the door, the air around them held a weight that felt impossible, like the beginning of something that could not be undone. He did not speak again. He simply reached toward her coat, and the small noise, the sound of something still breathing, filled the space between them. He pulled back the coat slowly, almost unwilling, fingers trembling despite himself. A newborn. Tiny, pale, wet with sweat, the outline of ribs visible beneath soft skin. The faintest whimper escaped it, too quiet, too small to demand the world's attention yet enough to punch him in the chest. He froze, breath caught, a dry rasp escaping his lips. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "Since sunrise," she whispered, barely meeting his eyes. Her hands gripped the railing, knuckles white, trembling. "You feed him," he said, voice sharper, almost accusing. "I tried," she admitted. No more words. Only the faint, shivering whimpers of the newborn between them. She swayed, knees buckling. He caught her before she hit the porch, one arm steadying her shoulder, the other pressed against her back. She sagged into him, exhausted, shaking, and he held her without thinking, instincts he didn't know he had guiding him. His hands hovered over the tiny life she carried. He had never held a child. Never wanted to, perhaps. And yet, here he was, fingers brushing against skin so fragile it might dissolve under pressure. The baby stirred in response, a weak, wet gasp that made him flinch. He pulled back slightly, unsure, clumsy, terrified of doing wrong. The woman watched him, wide-eyed, mouth parted, barely breathing. His own chest rose and fell unevenly, and for the first time in years he felt the weight of something alive pressing into his hands and shoulders and chest. "Is he okay?" she whispered, voice fragile. He swallowed, shook his head slightly. "I don't know," he said. His hands trembled as he adjusted his hold, careful not to crush, careful not to fall apart himself. He handed the newborn back to her too fast, but she caught him with a soft, instinctive ease. He watched her rock him, whispering fragments of comfort he didn't recognize in his own memory. She looked up at him, lips pressed tight, eyes fierce despite fatigue. She began. He cut her off with a stiff gesture, shaking his head. "Not yet." They stood frozen on the porch for a long moment, the wind brushing past them, stirring the coarse grass. The baby's faint cries continued, a fragile thread connecting them all. He looked past her to the horizon, to the empty land that pressed in from all sides, and realized that for a long time he had been carrying something just as silent inside him. "Come inside," he said finally, almost a growl. She hesitated, and he waited, holding the coat with one hand, steady now, certain despite the racing in his chest. She stepped past him, careful with the newborn, and they entered the dim hallway, the wooden floor creaking beneath her boots. The door shut behind them, a solid, final sound that echoed in his memory. Inside, shadows pooled in corners, cold and still, but the life pressed against him, whispered from the coat, made the silence speak. He watched her settle on the old sofa, rocking the newborn, unsure, exhausted, alive. He did not ask her name. She did not offer it. The air hung heavy with unspoken truths, with the weight of lives pressed into him, and for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he had thought impossible, the need to protect, to hold, to stay. The rustle beneath the coat, the faint, small breathing of the newborn, filled the room, filled him, filled the space between them with a fragile, trembling promise. He did not move, only watched, fingers brushing the fabric again, and whispered, almost to himself, "What are you hiding?" And the tiny sound answered him, a life insisting it existed, fragile and trembling, still breathing. She sat on the edge of the worn sofa, the baby in her arms, hands trembling as she tried to nurse. He stood stiff in the doorway, watching her, muscles tight, unsure how to move without breaking something fragile. The newborn's cry was thin, piercing, slicing through the quiet room. "He won't," she began, voice breaking. "He needs," he interrupted, voice clipped, blunt. "I know," she said, looking down, frustration and exhaustion etched into every line of her face. He moved across the floor slowly, deliberately, stiff as the boards beneath his boots. Reaching the counter, he pulled down the tin can he had used to feed calves last spring. Powdered milk. He hesitated. His thumb rubbed the edge. Could he use it? Should he? A baby, not a calf, yet desperation outweighed caution. He scooped, mixed, testing temperature with the inside of his wrist. Then, carefully, he approached her, hands shaking slightly, carrying the makeshift bottle. She looked up, wary. "What are you doing?" she asked, voice low, wary, like a caged animal ready to bite. "Helping," he said simply, setting the bottle in her hands. She took it, glanced at him, eyes sharp with both distrust and awe. He stepped back, uncertain, watching as she fed the baby. Her arms shook, but she managed. He didn't know if he could look away. "Why do you live alone?" she asked suddenly, soft but probing. He flinched, stiffened, did not answer. She looked at him, saw the shadow in his eyes, the tightness around his mouth. "You don't have to," she whispered, almost a plea. He nodded slightly, unwilling to speak, letting the silence stretch like the boards underfoot. The baby's tiny hand reached up, brushing his finger. He flinched sharply, almost stumbling back. She glanced at him, surprised, but didn't say anything. The fragile life clung to him, tiny, unspoken, and he realized for the first time in years how hollow his home had been. Nothing breathed in it, nothing stirred with his presence. He watched her, watched the baby, watched the rhythm of fragile feeding, and something ached deep inside, a pulse he hadn't felt in years. She rocked him gently, whispering fragments of comfort, and he could hear in those whispers all the words he hadn't said, all the grief he hadn't faced. His chest tightened, throat raw, and he realized that his own past, all the lost chances, the silence, and the empty crib, had carried him here, to this moment, to this fragile, trembling life. The baby cried again, a thin, persistent sound. She adjusted the bottle, murmuring, "Shoo, shoo, it's okay." He moved closer, hands twitching, unsure if he should reach or let her do it alone. His shadow fell over them, not threatening, just present, solid, like a wall against the quiet emptiness outside. Minutes passed. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The small life in her arms, the tiny sounds, the fragile warmth, filled the space he had carried alone for so long. He felt awe, fear, and something almost like hope. The baby gripped her finger, then loosened. He exhaled, quietly, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the boards. Inside, the small family, incomplete but alive, held each other against the dark, against loss, against the weight of what the land had taken. They sat at the table, the single lamp casting dim shadows across the rough wood. The baby slept in her arms, small and fragile, chest rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. Outside, the wind stirred dry grass, rattling the shutters. Silence filled the space between them, heavy and expectant. He watched her, watched the lines in her face, the exhaustion pressed into her shoulders, and felt the weight of his own unspoken past pressing back. "You got kids?" she asked finally, voice low, almost testing him. He shook his head, eyes fixed on the grain of the table. "No, you want them," she pressed, sharp, impatient. He hesitated, jaw tight. "Wanted," he admitted, the word rough, tasting like regret and years of loss. She looked down at the baby, then back at him, eyes wide, not judging, just seeing. He exhaled, shoulders sagging slightly. "The land, it took her," he said finally, voice low, almost broken. "My wife. We lost the baby. The well. I went there every day after, hoping. Nothing." He didn't look at it now, the old well hidden behind the house, shadowed and silent, a witness he could not face. She nodded slowly, understanding something without him needing to say it. "I ran," she said then, voice trembling. "From a man. Connected to the sheriff. Strong. He would have killed me." The church stayed quiet. Everyone stayed quiet. She pressed the baby closer, instinct protective, fierce. Names were unnecessary. Power was implied in every tense line of her body. He listened, silent, chest tight, hands resting on the table like anchors. Minutes passed. The baby stirred, shifting in her arms, then settled again. The tension in the room was a living thing, stretching and compressing between them. He realized he couldn't touch the child again, not yet, not without fear pressing him back. Not cruelty, but the fear of breaking what was so small, so fragile, so alive. "You'll be safe?" she asked quietly, almost a question to herself. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted to the window, to the dark shapes of the land outside, remembering the silence of empty rooms, of the crib that never held life, of hands pressed into the soil, waiting. "I can try," he said finally. It was all he could offer, a promise not of protection, not of safety, but of effort. The lamp flickered, shadows dancing across the walls, and the silence returned. Outside, a lone crow called, ragged and shrill. She adjusted the baby, whispering fragments of song, soft syllables that made him tense with unfamiliar emotion. His jaw tightened. He swallowed hard, breathing slow. The past pressed against him again, the hospital, the emptiness, the cold crib, the unanswered prayers. He glanced at her, at the baby, and the fear and hope and grief collided, sharp and immediate. "I won't touch him again," he said under his breath. "Not cruelty. Fear. Respect. Reverence." She didn't respond, only nodded once, eyes fixed on the child, chest rising slowly, holding what had been nearly lost. A faint whimper from the baby broke the stillness. He flinched, a reflex he could not suppress. The sound filled the room, echoing in corners where shadows lingered like memories. The woman's hand steadied the tiny form, and he exhaled slowly, realizing the small life pressed against her chest was more alive than anything he had held in years. The silence became a shared pulse, two bodies bound to the fragile rhythm of a newborn's breath, each learning the weight of what the land had taken and what might be saved. Outside, the wind rattled the boards again, but inside, in the dim lamplight, they existed in a fragile truce with the past. Words had been said, truths hinted at, and the baby slept, small and trembling, alive and insistent, a fragile promise between two people learning how to hold what the land had once refused to give them. She collapsed onto the sofa, her body finally giving way to exhaustion. The baby stirred in her arms, whimpering, small fists flailing. He had been standing near the doorway, tense, watching her carefully, unsure when or if he should move. The cry sharpened suddenly, and instinct overrode hesitation. He bent, scooped the newborn into his arms, stiff and awkward, holding him close against his chest. He could feel every fragile rib, every tiny heartbeat, trembling like a pulse against his own. "I won't keep you," he whispered, voice low, almost afraid to hear it. The baby's eyes fluttered open, barely aware of the world. "I know better," he added to himself, pacing the room slowly, rocking gently, as if the movement could steady more than just the child. She watched from the sofa, quiet now, exhaustion etched into her face, her eyes wide but not unkind. He kept the baby pressed against him, careful, reverent, aware of every small breath. Memories came unbidden, intrusive, a hospital room, sterile and cold, a crib empty, quiet, his wife lying still under sheets he couldn't pull back fast enough. He could still feel the emptiness, the ache of loss, as if it had never left him. This life, so fragile in his arms, was the first he had touched that demanded presence without asking permission. The baby whined softly. He shifted slightly, hands steadying the tiny body. "Shoo, shoo," he murmured, not sure if he was speaking to the child or to the years of grief pressing down on him. She stirred slightly on the sofa. "He's yours for now," she said softly, voice trembling. He looked at her, jaw tight. "Not mine," he said quickly. "Just, here." The night settled around them. Outside, wind swept across the dry land, rattling the boards, carrying faint echoes of the well he had once visited, the one that had swallowed hope in silence. He paced slowly, back and forth, rocking the baby in small arcs, careful not to jostle him too much. "I won't let you go," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. The baby's whimper faded into soft breaths, eyes closing again. He didn't sit. He could not. Sitting felt like surrender, like he might let the life slip through his fingers. Instead, he stood, the baby pressed against his chest, swaying in rhythm with memories he could not escape. Every heartbeat reminded him of empty rooms, of prayers unanswered, of years of silence that had once defined him. Now, each small sigh and tremor of this newborn filled the emptiness with presence. She watched him quietly, exhausted, yet alert, as if measuring the fragile distance between protection and possession. "You're tired," she said softly. He shook his head. "Can't stop," he said, voice rough, and kept walking, swaying. He whispered fragments, words he hadn't said to anyone in years: stay, breathe, alive. The baby, small and trembling, obeyed in the way only the smallest lives can, as if knowing this man carried more than just a body. Outside, the first hint of dawn crept across the land. Light pressed through cracks in the boards, illuminating dust motes in the quiet room. The baby's breathing remained steady, unbroken, and he exhaled slowly, relief tempered by exhaustion, realizing he had held something alive through the night. Not as a father, not yet, but as a man who had learned the weight of presence, the responsibility of being near, and the fragile wonder of survival. The truck engine rolled across the gravel outside, low and steady, shaking the boards underfoot. He froze, the baby pressed against his chest, listening. The woman stirred on the sofa, eyes wide, barely moving, one hand clutching the blanket around the infant. The sound of tires grinding against stone carried authority, a presence he didn't need to see to know. He exhaled slowly, tense, aware that the quiet walls of the house offered no protection against what might be coming. "Seen a woman pass through?" A voice called from outside. Friendly, casual, but sharp, calculating. His jaw tightened. He adjusted his hold on the baby, instinctive, careful, reverent. "Lots of folks pass," he said, voice flat, controlled. Another pause, footsteps crunching nearer. He could hear the weight of inspection in each movement. The baby stirred, whimpering, and she pressed him closer, whispering softly, almost pleading. "Stay quiet," she murmured. He nodded once, still holding him firmly, eyes narrowing toward the window. The deputy's gaze swept the house, inspecting, lingering, sharp and deliberate, as if he could see every secret pressed into the walls. The deputy's eyes flicked to the counter, where the tin can and spoon still lay. Milk, evidence of life, of intrusion. He forced a shrug, casual, unconcerned. Just cleaning up, he said, voice tight. "MH," the deputy replied, leaning slightly on the frame. "This land remembers whose side's wrong," he said quietly, almost a warning, before walking back to the truck. The engine roared to life again, fading into the distance. The silence returned, thick and tense, punctuated only by the small, fragile breathing of the baby. She exhaled shakily. "That was close," she whispered. He didn't answer immediately. He moved to the door, locking it carefully, deliberately, hearing each click as if it was a heartbeat. The weight of responsibility pressed into him, not for himself, but for the fragile life pressed against his chest. "Why?" she asked quietly, voice trembling. "Why do they care?" He glanced at her, jaw tight. "Power," he said. "They care who belongs to what, who survives. Names don't protect you. Not here." She absorbed it, nodding slowly, tiny hands tightening around the baby. The quiet intensity of her gaze, the raw honesty in her posture, reminded him of why he had risked opening the door, why he had touched something alive again. He moved across the floor, pacing slightly, rocking the infant gently. Each step a rhythm of protection and anticipation, of presence measured against the threat pressing outside. Her gaze followed him, wide, alert, learning, as if measuring the invisible lines between safety and danger. "We can't stay," she said softly. "I know," he replied, voice low, even as his body tensed, unwilling to let go of what he held. The baby stirred again, tiny fists twitching. He whispered softly, fragments of words he hadn't spoken in years, "Stay alive. Just stay alive." The air between them was heavy with unspoken fears, with fragile hope, with the acknowledgement that the outside world demanded obedience to power and names meant nothing. He could feel it pressing against the walls, pressing against his chest, yet inside, the small life in his arms remained stubbornly, insistently alive. Minutes passed. He finally allowed himself to exhale, slowly, carefully. The truck was gone. The wind still rattled the boards outside, but inside, in the quiet dim, they existed in fragile equilibrium, a woman, a newborn, a man learning the weight of presence, and the unspoken knowledge that the land would remember everything they had done tonight. She stood in the doorway, trembling, arms crossed over her chest as the baby slept quietly against the blanket. He watched her, careful not to speak, careful not to break the fragile trust between them. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until she finally spoke. "You don't owe us," she said, voice sharp and trembling, almost defiant. He shook his head slightly, jaw tight. "I know," he said. His voice was flat, controlled, but beneath it there was tension, unease. "Then why are you scared?" she pressed, stepping closer, eyes wide. He exhaled slowly, reluctant, remembering the weight of years pressed into his chest, the empty rooms, the quiet of a crib that had never been filled. "Because," he hesitated, fingers twitching, tracing the edge of the doorframe. "I once begged God to take my unborn son. Every day. Didn't matter how loud I shouted or how quiet I whispered. He didn't come. The land kept him from me." She glanced down at the sleeping baby, her hand tightening around the blanket as if feeling his pulse. I was attacked," she said suddenly, voice breaking. "A man. Strong. Connected to the sheriff." The church stayed silent. Everyone stayed silent. "I had no one." Her words came fast, clipped, urgent. The baby stirred slightly in her arms. She adjusted him carefully, watching him closely. He's not even mine by choice. He was taken from me in every way that mattered. I barely survived." He exhaled, moving toward the back door. "Come with me," he said. She followed silently. They walked out across the porch, the boards creaking under their weight, to the old well hidden in shadows. He stopped at the edge, staring down into the darkness, the empty depth a mirror for the grief he'd carried for years. "This well," he whispered, voice rough, almost to himself, "I went here every day after it. Hoped for a miracle. Nothing came." She stood beside him, the baby pressed against her chest. You stayed?" she asked softly. He nodded. Someone has to stay, he said simply. His eyes didn't leave the darkness. Some of us carry weight so heavy we forget what light feels like. Her gaze softened slightly, understanding the truth of that, and for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe without trembling. He glanced at her, fingers brushing the edge of the well stone. And you, he asked quietly. Why are you here? Why come to me? She met his gaze, expression fierce and tired. Because you didn't look away. Because the land remembers some things. And tonight, it will remember that we were alive, that someone was here to hold him when the rest would not. The wind blew across the open land, carrying dust, carrying dry leaves, carrying the scent of something old and silent. He closed his eyes briefly, letting it press against his skin, remembering the empty crib, the unspoken prayers, the whispered regrets. When he opened them again, the baby stirred lightly in her arms, a soft sound, small and insistent. He exhaled, finally stepping back from the well. Then we hold him, he said, voice low but firm. Because what survives is more important than what should have been. And what should have been, the land already took. She nodded once, eyes steady now, and they walked back toward the house together, the baby between them, small, trembling, alive. The well waited behind them, silent and shadowed, listening, keeping the weight of what had been lost and what was still alive. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke, dust, and milk, but it was warm. Safe, for now. He carried presents in his hands, in his chest, in his steps, and knew the world outside could wait. The well had heard. He would not look away again. He moved across the kitchen floor, the baby in her arms, handing her a clean blanket. Hold him like this, he said, voice calm, measured, showing rather than telling. She adjusted the tiny body, careful, deliberate. He watched her, noting the way her hands moved, precise and protective. Don't squeeze too hard, he said. He's fragile. She nodded without speaking, eyes on the child. He could see her tension, the fear that every movement might break him. Will you kill for us? She asked suddenly, voice low, almost a test. He paused mid-step, wiping his hands on a rag. I don't know, he said, blunt. She glanced at him, measuring, not asking for heroics, just honesty. He picked up the rifle from the table, set it on the counter, and began cleaning, methodical, steady, oil and cloth sliding over the metal. The smell of gun oil filled the room, sharp and familiar. She adjusted the baby again, whispering softly. You'll protect him, won't you? She asked. His eyes didn't leave the rifle. I'll try, he said, voice low. He had never been asked for protection before. Not like this. Not for someone so small, so fragile, so alive. Outside, the wind rattled the boards, carrying the faint scent of dust and dry grass, of the land waiting for something to break. The baby's eyes opened briefly, staring at him, unafraid. He froze, hands on the rifle, realizing the weight of presence in the room. Not gun or threat or past. Presence. Care. He exhaled slowly, letting his shoulders loosen, the tension bleeding out into deliberate, careful movement. He returned the rifle to the counter, half-cleaned, and took a step closer. You've got to keep him steady, he said softly, pointing at the baby's back. Shh, don't let him jerk too much. She nodded, whispering murmurs, adjusting tiny limbs. He watched, noticing the way her voice softened, how her posture relaxed, how life demanded attention and care, not rules and cruelty. Minutes passed in careful silence. He moved to the table, tidying scraps of bread and milk tin, hands slow, precise. The baby murmured softly, stretching tiny fists, warm against the blanket. He glanced at her, eyes meeting hers, understanding unspoken but complete. No names had been spoken today. No promises. Only survival, only small breaths, only presence. The wind outside rose again, rattling the shutters. He listened, tense, alert, but inside, the baby remained calm, sleeping between them, a fragile anchor. What if they come back? She asked softly. He didn't answer immediately, focusing on oiling the rifle, smoothing every corner. Then we do what we have to, he said finally. No bravado. No courage claimed. Only truth. The smell of gun oil mingled with warm milk and the faint tang of fear in the room. He moved closer again, hands brushing hers as she adjusted the blanket around the baby. "You're learning," he said quietly. "Not enough," she replied, voice low but steady. They shared a faint smile, tiny and brief. Outside, the world waited, full of threats, silence, and power. Inside, the house held fragile life, care, and the deliberate act of watching, of holding, of refusing to look away. A sudden rumble of multiple trucks far off in the distance made him tense again. The baby stirred, eyes opening briefly. He pressed him closer against the blanket, body stiff but steady. "Stay alive," he whispered, not to anyone, not fully to himself, but as a promise. The trucks rumbled closer, but the room remained quiet, warm, alive. The sheriff arrived in the late afternoon, when the dust still hung low and the house felt smaller than it had that morning. His truck stopped by the fence. He did not rush. He stepped out slow, hat clean, badge catching the sun like it wanted to be noticed. The rancher stayed on the porch. The woman stood behind him, the baby tight to her chest. The sheriff looked at the house, then the land, then the child. He smiled without warmth and said he had been meaning to come by. The rancher asked what for. The sheriff said for peace. The rancher said peace never rode in a county truck. The sheriff stepped closer and kept his voice calm. He said people were talking. He said papers were moving. He said things had a way of being decided before a man knew they were on his desk. The rancher told him to say it plain. The sheriff nodded and said that child ain't yours. The woman sucked in a breath. The rancher did not move. He said neither is this land, if the law wanted to be honest. The sheriff smiled again and said the law does not need honesty, it needs order. The sheriff said the woman had a record now. He said the baby had questions tied to him. He said the rancher had debts no one talked about. He said seizures happen fast and cells were quiet places. The woman stepped forward, shaking, voice breaking but loud. She said touch him and I will scream until the ground remembers it. The sheriff looked at her like she was weather. He said screaming never saved anyone. The rancher reached back and took the baby, held him open in both arms. He said not here. He said not today. He said you don't take him. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He said this can end clean. He said hand him over and we forget the rest. The rancher said no. The sheriff said think of prison. The rancher said I am. The sheriff said think of ruin. The rancher said I live in it already. Silence stretched. The baby gripped the rancher's shirt, fingers strong. The sheriff watched that hand. He stepped back. He said nothing else. He left with the promise unspoken, and the dust settled slow around the fence. Night pressed in after the sheriff left, but the house stayed awake. The woman sat at the table, hands around a cold cup. The rancher stood by the stove, rocking the baby slow. She asked what he wanted. He kept his eyes on the bottle and said nothing. She asked again, sharper. He said I want him safe. She said that's not ownership. He nodded and said I know. He said it anyway, like saying it might keep the walls standing. She asked where they would go. He said the creek road first. She said the bridge was watched. He said then the rail cut. She said dogs run there. He said I'll drive you past the bend. She said they will follow. He said they always do. Their voices stayed low, quick, like they were trading tools. She said she could walk nights. He said the moon would give her away. She said she would crawl if she had to. He said don't say that. She said don't tell me what not to do. He opened a drawer and pulled letters tied with twine. He said these were hers. She asked whose. He said my wife's. He said read. She read one line and stopped. She said she wanted children here. He said yes. She said foster. He said yes. He said I couldn't. She asked why. He said because my body said no and my fear said louder. She said fear of what? He said loving something that leaves. The baby fussed. He fed him by the stove, hands steady, face blank. Tears came anyway, silent, falling into his beard. The woman watched and said, "You're allowed." He said nothing. She said, "You're allowed to want him safe." He said, "That's all I have." She said, "It's enough." He shook his head. He said, "Not for keeping." She said, "For choosing." They planned again. She said, "Dawn or dark." He said, "Dark buys time." She said, "The well path hides sound." He said, "I'll board it after." She said, "You don't owe me." He said, "I owe him a chance." She said, "That's not ownership." He said, "I know." Night fell again, thick and undecided. He sat with the baby against his chest and listened to the house. She asked if he ever tried doctors. He said, "Once." She said, "What did they say?" He said, "Numbers and shrugs." She said, "That's not a sentence." He said it was enough to close a door. She said, "Doors can open other ways." He said, "I didn't see them then." She said, "What do you see now?" He said, "Space." He said, "Room where a child could arrive already wounded and still be wanted." She stood and walked the floor. She said, "If I leave tonight, will you regret it?" He said, "I will regret every ending." She said, "Answer me." He said, "No." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because keeping you here would be theft." She said, "And letting us go?" He said, "Is care." The baby slept. Night gathered at the windows. The choice stayed unfinished. He fed him again, slow, careful. Milk dripped. He wiped it with his thumb. She watched and said, "You learned fast." He said, "I had room." She said, "That's space again." He said, "Yes." Outside, crickets started. Inside, nothing was decided. The lamp dimmed. He held the bottle like a promise he would not claim. She turned away to pack. Darkness settled. Morning was still a question. No one spoke. The baby breathed. Time waited. The night did not answer. Yet. Still. The truck stopped outside all at once. Gravel crunched. Doors slammed. He didn't move right away. The baby was warm against his chest, small fingers gripping his shirt like instinct knew more than fear. The woman stood behind him, breath shallow, eyes locked on the door. A knock came, slow and confident, like it already owned the answer. "Open up," a voice called. Calm. Polite. Heavy. He shifted his stance, squared his shoulders. "You can speak," he said through the door. A pause. Then, softer, closer. "We're just checking on something." He opened the door halfway. The sheriff stood there, hat low, badge catching the light. Men flanked him, quiet, watching. The sheriff's eyes dropped immediately to the baby. He smiled without warmth. "That child ain't yours," he said. The woman stepped forward before he could answer. Her voice shook, but it carried. "He's mine." The sheriff didn't look at her. "Didn't ask you," he said. He looked back at the rancher. "Neither is this land," the sheriff added. "You just live on it." He tightened his hold on the baby. "He's not leaving," he said. Simple. Flat. The sheriff chuckled softly. "You sure about that?" He stepped closer. "I can take this place. Taxes. Code. Safety. I can take you too." The baby stirred. A small sound. The rancher didn't flinch. "You already took enough," he said. The sheriff's smile thinned. "You talking about your wife?" he asked lightly. "That was God's work." The woman gasped. "You don't get to say her name," the rancher said. The sheriff leaned in, voice low. "You think holding that baby makes you clean?" he asked. "You think one night fixes what men like us do?" Silence stretched. Wind moved through dry grass. The men behind the sheriff shifted, uneasy. The woman stepped fully into the doorway now. Her hands shook, but her voice rose. "You covered it," she said. "You knew what he did." The sheriff finally looked at her. His eyes hardened. "Careful," he warned. "Loud women don't last long out here." The rancher moved then, just enough to block her. He held the baby higher, open, visible. "You want him," he said. "You'll have to take him from me." The sheriff studied him, really looked this time. Saw the set jaw. The stillness. The refusal. "That's a bad road," the sheriff said. "Every road is bad," the rancher replied. "Some just end honest." The baby gripped tighter, grounding him, warm and alive. He felt it anchor him to the moment, to the choice already made. The sheriff straightened. He adjusted his hat. "This isn't over," he said. "It never is." He stepped back. One by one, the men followed. No arrest. No papers. Just threat hanging in the air like smoke. The trucks started again. Gravel screamed under tires. The sound faded, slow and deliberate, like a promise dragged behind them. The rancher closed the door, locked it, and leaned his forehead briefly against the wood. The woman exhaled a sob she had been holding. "You didn't have to," she whispered. He looked down at the baby. "I did," he said. "I already crossed it." The baby's hand loosened, then tightened again, alive and stubborn. Outside, power retreated for now. Inside, something had shifted for good. He stood there holding the child, knowing the badge would never wash what had been done, knowing silence was no longer an option, knowing some lines, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. The house stayed quiet long after the trucks were gone. He sat at the table with the baby cradled in one arm, bottle balanced carefully in the other. The woman watched him from across the room, eyes red, face set like she was bracing for another blow. The baby sucked slowly, uneven but determined, small sounds filling the silence the sheriff left behind. "What do you want?" she asked finally. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, fingers twisting together. He didn't look up right away. He watched the baby swallow, watched the rise and fall of his chest. "I want him safe," he said. "That's not ownership," she replied quickly. "I know," he said. "It's space." She frowned. "Space for what?" He hesitated, jaw tight. "For him to live without being claimed by men who think blood is the only rule." She moved closer, cautious. "You can't fix this," she said. "You can't make what happened disappear." He nodded once. "I'm not trying to." The baby paused, then resumed feeding, tiny hand gripping his thumb. He flinched, then let it stay. They spread a map across the table. Old roads. Back paths. Places without names. "You take this road before sunrise," he said. "You don't stop. You don't ask." She studied it, memorizing. "And you?" she asked. He shrugged. "I stay." She looked at him sharply. "They'll come back." "I know." "They'll hurt you." "Probably." The words were blunt, stripped of drama. She swallowed hard. "Why?" He reached into a drawer and pulled out a stack of letters, yellowed, tied with twine. He set them between them. "She wrote these," he said. "My wife." She hesitated, then touched the paper gently. "She wanted to foster," he continued. "Said there were already too many children the land didn't want." His voice cracked once, then steadied. "I said no. I was afraid." The woman's eyes filled. "You were hurting," she said. "I was empty," he replied. The baby finished the bottle, mouth slackening, eyes fluttering closed. He wiped milk from the corner of the tiny mouth with his thumb, slow and careful. A tear slid down his cheek without sound. She watched him cry, silent and contained. "You don't owe us your body," she said. "Your land. Your life." He shook his head. I owe him honesty, he said. And you time. They packed quietly. A bag. Food. A blanket. The baby slept through it all, breathing steady. Outside, night pressed in again, thick and watchful. She stood at the door, hesitating. If I don't make it, she began. You will, he said, firm. You already have. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. If you wanted, she said, you could have taken him. He met her gaze. That's the point, he said. I didn't. He fed the baby once more, slow and gentle. Tears fell again, unchecked. He didn't wipe them away. He let them drop onto the worn wood floor, joining older stains, older grief. Outside, the land waited. Inside, something had shifted shape, from loss to space, from silence to choice. Night settled fully around the house. The plan was made. Nothing was finished. He held the baby a moment longer than necessary, breathing him in, knowing that blood wasn't the only bond that mattered, knowing some bonds were chosen, and that choice carried its own kind of weight. The baby grew restless as the night deepened. Small sounds turned sharp, then soft again, a rhythm that refused sleep. He lifted him without being asked, arms steady now, practiced in a way that surprised him. The woman sat nearby, knees pulled close, watching every movement like she might need to remember it later. He doesn't want to settle, she said quietly. He will, he replied. He began to pace, slow steps across the floor, rocking just enough to calm the trembling body against his chest. The baby's breath hitched, then steadied. I got you, he whispered, words barely formed. I got you for now. She stood, then sat again, unable to rest. You don't have to stay up, she said. He shook his head. I will, he answered. Simple. Final. He held the baby close, feeling warmth, weight, life. It terrified him how fast it felt necessary. Hours passed without counting. The lamp burned low. Outside, insects buzzed, then quieted. He whispered things he never planned to say out loud. You're not broken. You're not a mistake. You don't owe anyone your breath. The baby shifted, a tiny sigh escaping, and settled again. She watched, tears slipping freely now. You're saying goodbye, she said. He didn't deny it. I don't know how to do that, he replied. I only know how to hold on. She nodded, understanding more than words aloud. The baby woke again near dawn, fussing, fists tight. He adjusted his grip, murmuring low, half prayer, half confession. Stay, he said. Even when I can't. The words scraped something raw loose in him. He felt it, didn't stop it. She came closer, resting a hand briefly on his arm. You saved us, she said. I didn't, he replied. I just didn't look away. The baby's cry softened, fading into breath, then sleep. He felt the moment stretching thin, fragile, ending. Light crept through the window, pale and unforgiving. Morning didn't rush. It waited. She stood, shoulders squared now, resolve settling in. It's time, she said. He nodded once. His arms tightened instinctively, then loosened. He handed the baby back slowly, careful not to rush the separation. Their hands overlapped longer than needed. The baby stirred, fingers brushing his shirt, then curling into her sleeve instead. He swallowed hard. You keep him alive, he said. That's all. She adjusted the blanket, holding the baby close. You changed him, she said. He shook his head. He changed me. They packed the truck in silence. The engine coughed, then steadied. She paused before climbing in, eyes shining. If they come, she said. They already did, he replied. Now they know. She hesitated, then leaned down, pressing her forehead briefly to his chest. Thank you, she whispered. He closed his eyes for half a second. Go, he said. The truck rolled away, slow at first, then faster, dust rising behind it. He stood alone in the yard, hands empty, chest aching. The sun climbed higher. The house felt larger, quieter, changed. Inside, the crib remained. Outside, the land watched. He stood there until the sound of the engine was gone, knowing the night had taken something from him, and left something too. She came closer, resting a hand briefly on his arm. "You saved us," she said. "I didn't," he replied. "I just didn't look away." The baby's cry softened, fading into breath, then sleep. He felt the moment stretching thin, fragile, ending. Light crept through the window, pale and unforgiving. Morning didn't rush. It waited. She stood, shoulders squared now, resolve settling in. "It's time," she said. He nodded once. His arms tightened instinctively, then loosened. He handed the baby back slowly, careful not to rush the separation. Their hands overlapped longer than needed. The baby stirred, fingers brushing his shirt, then curling into her sleeve instead. He swallowed hard. "You keep him alive," he said. "That's all." She adjusted the blanket, holding the baby close. "You changed him," she said. He shook his head. "He changed me." They packed the truck in silence. The engine coughed, then steadied. She paused before climbing in, eyes shining. "If they come," she said. "They already did," he replied. "Now they know." She hesitated, then leaned down, pressing her forehead briefly to his chest. "Thank you," she whispered. He closed his eyes for half a second. "Go," he said. The truck rolled away, slow at first, then faster, dust rising behind it. He stood alone in the yard, hands empty, chest aching. The sun climbed higher. The house felt larger, quieter, changed. Inside, the crib remained. Outside, the land watched. He stood there until the sound of the engine was gone, knowing the night had taken something from him, and left something too.